Maria Santos had worked in the Reyes household for nearly 3 years before anyone noticed what she was doing in the music room. She was a quiet woman, 26 years old, who had come to Manila from a small province in the south with nothing but a worn canvas bag and a determination to send money home to her mother and 2 younger siblings. The Reyes family was wealthy by any standard. Their home sat behind iron gates in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city, with marble floors, a staff of 7, and rooms that most people her age would never see in their lifetime except in magazines. Maria cleaned those rooms every morning starting at 6, moving through the house like a shadow, careful never to disturb anything or draw attention to herself. The youngest member of the Reyes family was a boy named Gabriel. He was 9 years old when Maria first arrived, small for his age, with thick dark hair and a serious face that made him look older than he was. Gabriel had been blind since birth, a condition that his father, Ernesto Reyes, had spent considerable time and money trying to correct through surgeries and specialist consultations across several countries. Nothing had worked. Gabriel moved through the world using his hands, his ears, and a sharpness of mind that surprised almost everyone who spoke with him for more than 5 minutes. He attended a school for the visually impaired during the week and spent his afternoons at home, usually alone in the large sala or in his bedroom, listening to the radio or to audiobooks his teachers sent home with him. The music room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway lined with framed photographs of the Reyes family across generations. It contained a grand piano that had belonged to Gabriel's late mother, Elena, who had died of an illness when Gabriel was 4. Ernesto Reyes had not touched that room in years. He kept it locked most of the time, but Maria had a key because her duties included dusting the furniture and keeping the space clean once a week. She had grown up hearing music in her province, in the church on Sundays, and from her own mother who sang while cooking. Maria had never owned an instrument, but she had taught herself a few simple songs on a borrowed keyboard at a neighbor's house when she was a teenager, pressing the keys slowly until her fingers remembered where to go. One afternoon, about 4 months after she started working for the family, Maria was cleaning the music room when Gabriel appeared at the doorway. She had not heard him approach because he walked softly, already trained from years of moving carefully through spaces. He stood there with his head tilted slightly to one side, which she had come to understand was how he listened. He asked her what that sound was, and she realized she had been humming while she worked, a habit she usually suppressed inside the house. She apologized and told him it was nothing, just a song she knew. He asked her if she could play the piano. She hesitated, then told him she only knew a little, nothing impressive. He walked further into the room without being invited, ran his fingers along the edge of the piano bench, and sat down. He pressed one key with a single finger and held his face very still as the note rang out and faded. He said it was beautiful. That was where it started. Maria did not plan it. She did not think about consequences or whether it was her place to be in that room with the son of her employer. She only saw a child reaching toward something with his whole body, every bit of his attention focused on the sound coming from a single key. She sat beside him on the bench and placed his hand over hers so he could feel how she pressed the keys. She played a short, simple melody, just 6 notes, the kind a child learns first. Gabriel was silent for a moment and then asked her to do it again. She did. He asked if he could try. She guided his fingers to the right position and told him where to press. He got 3 notes right on his first attempt and smiled in a way that Maria would remember for a long time. Over the following weeks, their sessions grew longer. Maria began bringing Gabriel to the music room in the late afternoon when the rest of the staff were occupied, and Ernesto Reyes was still at his office downtown. She taught him how to find the keys by feel, how to count the spaces between notes with his fingertips, how to memorize a sequence not by reading it, but by building muscle memory through repetition. Gabriel learned with a speed that surprised her. He did not need to see the piano to understand it. He heard everything she played and reproduced it with small adjustments until it matched what he remembered from her demonstration. Within a month, he had learned 4 short pieces and could play them without stopping. Maria never told anyone in the house what she was doing. She was not certain it was allowed, and she did not want to lose her job by overstepping. But she also could not stop. Gabriel came to the music room every afternoon and waited for her, sitting at the bench with his hands folded in his lap and his face turned toward the door. He never asked her why she was teaching him or whether his father knew. He only asked her to keep going. And she did, because in all the time she had worked in that house, she had never seen that child look the way he looked when his fingers found the right notes and the music filled the room around them, quiet and real and entirely his own. Ernesto Reyes was not a man who came home early. His days were structured around meetings, phone calls, and decisions that affected hundreds of employees across his construction and property development company. He left the house before 7 in the morning and rarely returned before 8 at night. On most evenings, he ate alone in the dining room, read through documents at his desk for an hour or two, and went to bed. His relationship with Gabriel was not cold exactly, but it carried a distance that neither of them knew how to close. Ernesto loved his son deeply, but love in his case expressed itself through provision, through the best schools and therapists and medical consultations, through a household that ran smoothly and gave Gabriel everything he needed. Sitting together, talking about ordinary things, those moments were rare and often awkward in the way that silence between two people can be when neither one knows how to begin. Gabriel did not complain about his father. He was a child who had grown up understanding, without being told directly, that his father carried grief the way some people carry old injuries, quietly and constantly. Ernesto had never fully recovered from losing Alina. Her death had closed something in him that he kept shut with work and routine. The music room being locked was not a decision he had announced or explained. It had simply happened, the way certain rooms in grieving households become sealed off not by intention but by the weight of association. Alina had played piano every Sunday morning, and the sound had filled the entire upper floor of the house. After she was gone, no one touched the instrument, and eventually the room became a place the staff cleaned and no one else entered. What Ernesto did not know was that his son had been entering that room every afternoon for nearly 2 months, sitting at his late mother's piano and learning to play it. He did not know because Gabriel did not tell him, and Maria certainly did not tell him, and the other household staff either had not noticed or had chosen not to involve themselves. The house was large enough that sounds from the second-floor music room did not carry easily to the ground floor, especially in the late afternoon when the kitchen was active, and the television in the staff common area was usually on. The secret stayed contained, the way small secrets do when no one is looking for them. It was a Thursday when Ernesto came home earlier than usual. A meeting had been canceled, and he had developed a headache by midday that his assistant had gently suggested might benefit from rest. He arrived at the house just after 5, which by the standard of his usual schedule was almost unheard of. He gave his driver a brief instruction, took off his jacket in the entry hall, and started up the stairs to his bedroom. He was halfway up when he heard it. It stopped him completely. The sound was coming from the second floor, from the direction of the music room. It was piano music, slow and careful but unmistakably deliberate, the kind of playing that belonged to someone still learning but already beginning to understand what they were doing. He stood on the stairs and listened without moving. His first thought was that someone had turned on a recording. His second thought, arriving almost immediately after, was that recordings did not have that quality of human imperfection, the slight pause before a difficult sequence, the way a note was held a fraction longer than it should be, as if the player was listening to it fade before moving forward. He walked up the remaining stairs and down the hallway toward the music room. The door was not fully closed. Through the gap he could see the edge of the piano bench and a portion of the window, afternoon light coming through the thin curtains. He pushed the door open slowly. What he saw took him a moment to process completely. Gabriel was sitting at the piano with his back straight and his head slightly bowed, his fingers moving across the keys with a concentration that made his whole body still. Beside him on the bench sat Maria, watching his hands and occasionally reaching over to reposition a finger or whisper something too quiet to hear from the doorway. Gabriel played through a short sequence, stopped, shook his head and played it again. The second time was better. Maria said something to him in a low voice and he nodded and tried the opening bars of a different piece. Ernesto did not speak. He stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time but was probably less than a minute. He was not angry. He was not yet anything that had a clean name. He was watching his blind son play his dead wife's piano in a room he had not entered in 5 years, guided by a young woman who had no formal training and no instruction to be there, and the music was small and imperfect and more alive than anything he had heard in that house in a very long time. Maria noticed him first. She stood up from the bench so quickly that the movement made Gabriel stop playing and turn his head toward the door with that listening expression Maria had come to know well. He asked what happened. Maria did not answer immediately. She was looking at Ernesto with the expression of someone who has been discovered doing something they cannot fully explain or apologize for because they are not entirely sure it was wrong. She said his name, Mr. Reyes, and the words that followed were an apology that she started and could not quite finish. Ernesto held up one hand to stop her. He looked at Gabriel, who had turned back toward the keys and placed his fingers on them again without pressing down, waiting. Ernesto stepped into the room fully for the first time in years. He pulled a chair from the corner and sat down a few feet from the piano. He told Gabriel to keep playing. His voice was steady, but something in it had shifted, something that Maria heard and could not name but recognized as important. Gabriel turned his face briefly toward his father, then back toward the keys. After a short pause he began again, and the music filled the room. And for the first time in that house, the three of them were in the same space at the same time without any distance between them at all. The days that followed that Thursday afternoon changed the shape of the household in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. Ernesto Reyes did not fire Maria. He did not reprimand her or call her into his study for a formal conversation about boundaries and professional conduct. He did not say much about what he had witnessed at all, at least not immediately. But the staff noticed that something had shifted in the way he moved through the house. He started coming home earlier. Not every day, but often enough that it became a pattern the cook and the housekeeper remarked on quietly between themselves. He would arrive by 6, sometimes even 5:30, and instead of going directly to his desk or the dining room, he would go upstairs. Maria continued teaching Gabriel every afternoon, but now the door to the music room stayed open. That single change carried more meaning than anything that could have been said out loud. A closed door in that house had meant privacy, containment, the preservation of something fragile. An open door meant that what was happening inside was no longer a secret and no longer needed to be. Gabriel noticed the change too, though he expressed it only by playing with slightly less caution, allowing himself to make mistakes without immediately tensing, letting the music be imperfect in the way that learning always is before it becomes something more. Ernesto began sitting in the room while they practiced. He did not interrupt. He brought a folder of documents with him the first few times, as if to tell himself and everyone else that he was simply working in a different location, that his presence was incidental. But the documents sat unopened on his knee more often than not. He watched Gabriel's hands move across the keys and listened in the particular way that people listen when they are hearing more than music, when the sound is carrying something personal and unspoken alongside the notes themselves. Maria was aware of him in the room and adjusted to his presence the way one adjusts to a change in weather. Not dramatically, but in small unconscious ways. She spoke to Gabriel in the same calm instructive tone she always used, and Ernesto's presence gradually stopped feeling like observation and started feeling like participation, even though he never touched the piano and rarely spoke. One evening, near the end of the second week of this new arrangement, Ernesto asked Maria where she had learned to play. It was the first direct question he had addressed to her that was not related to household duties, and it surprised her enough that she answered honestly before she had time to consider how the answer might sound. She told him about the borrowed keyboard at her neighbor's house in her province, about teaching herself by ear because there was no one to show her and no money for lessons, about the way she had memorized songs by feel because she could not read music. Ernesto listened without expression, then nodded slowly and said nothing more that evening. But Maria sensed that the question had not been idle, that he was assembling something in his mind, and the answer she had given was one piece of it. A week after that conversation, a woman named Sita arrived at the house. She was in her 50s, formally dressed, carrying a leather satchel, and she introduced herself to the household staff as a piano instructor. She had been brought in by Ernesto, quietly and without announcement, to assess Gabriel's playing and determine whether formal lessons were appropriate. Maria learned about this arrival from the housekeeper about 20 minutes before it happened and spent those 20 minutes in a state of anxiety she could not fully suppress. She did not know if the instructor's arrival meant that her role in Gabriel's learning was finished, that she had been a temporary and unofficial solution now being replaced by something proper and credentialed. Sita spent an hour with Gabriel in the music room. Maria waited downstairs, telling herself to focus on her work and finding that she could not. She polished the same section of countertop 3 times without noticing. When she finally heard footsteps on the stairs, she positioned herself near the kitchen doorway and watched Sita cross the entry hall toward the sala where Ernesto was waiting. She could not hear what was said, but the conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes, and when it ended, Sita's expression as she passed back through the entry hall was one of thoughtful surprise, the look of someone who expected to find ordinary results and found something else instead. That evening, Ernesto came to find Maria in the kitchen while she was helping prepare dinner. He asked her to step into the hallway for a moment. She dried her hands and followed him, already bracing herself for whatever was coming. He told her that Sita would be coming twice a week to give Gabriel formal instruction. He told her that Sita had said Gabriel's ear was exceptional, that whoever had been working with him had understood intuitively how to teach someone who processed music through sound and touch rather than through visual reading of notation. Then he paused in the way people pause when what comes next is harder to say than what came before. He told Maria that he wanted her to continue working with Gabriel on the days when Sita was not there, that she should consider it a formal part of her responsibilities, and that her salary would be adjusted to reflect the additional role. Maria looked at him for a moment without speaking. She had prepared herself for dismissal or for a polite reduction of her involvement, a thank you and a gentle closing of the door. She had not prepared herself for this. She told him she was not a trained teacher and did not want him to expect more than she was able to give. He said that what she had already given was more than he had known to ask for, and that he trusted her to continue. It was not a long conversation, and it was not emotional in an obvious way. But when Maria returned to the kitchen, her hands were unsteady, and she kept her face turned toward the stove so no one would see her expression. Gabriel was told about Sita's visits that same evening at dinner. His reaction was quiet and considered, the way his reactions always were. He asked if Maria would still be there. Ernesto told him yes. Gabriel picked up his fork and continued eating, and the small, satisfied nod he gave before he did was the closest thing to celebration that anyone in that household had seen in a very long time. Sonnet 4. 6. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please. 3 months after Sita began her twice-weekly visits, Gabriel Reyes performed in front of an audience for the first time. It was not a grand event or a public recital. It was a small gathering that Ernesto had organized quietly at the house, inviting a handful of close family friends, his sister and her husband, 2 colleagues he trusted, and the principal of Gabriel's school who had expressed interest in the boy's progress after Ernesto mentioned it during a routine meeting. The music room had been rearranged slightly, chairs brought in and positioned in a loose semicircle facing the piano. Someone had placed a vase of white flowers on the side table near the window. The curtains were drawn back fully for the first time Maria could remember, letting the late afternoon light come in without obstruction. Maria had helped Gabriel prepare for 2 weeks. They had worked on 3 pieces together, choosing them carefully based on what he played most naturally and most confidently, not the most technically impressive pieces, but the ones that came from him honestly, the ones where his body relaxed into the music instead of working against it. Sita had approved the selection and added her own refinements to his technique during her sessions, sharpening the transitions between phrases and helping him manage his timing in the sections where he tended to rush. Gabriel absorbed every correction without frustration, which Sita had told Ernesto was itself unusual, that most young students resisted adjustment, but Gabriel treated each correction as information he was grateful to receive. On the afternoon of the gathering, Gabriel sat in his room while Maria helped him with his shirt collar. He was not visibly nervous in the way children often are before performances, bouncing or talking too much or going very quiet in an obvious way. He was simply still, which was his version of nervous, a stillness that was slightly more concentrated than his usual calm. He asked Maria if she thought his father would be pleased. She told him that his father was already pleased, that this was simply an opportunity for other people to hear what she had been hearing for months. Gabriel considered this for a moment and then asked her if she was nervous. She told him honestly that she was, more than he was probably, and he smiled at that, and said he was glad he was not the only one. The guests settled into the chairs with the slightly self-conscious politeness of people who are not sure what they are about to witness. Ernesto stood near the back of the room rather than sitting, which Maria noticed and understood. Standing gave him the option of controlling his expression and his reactions without being observed directly by the people seated in front of him. Gabriel entered the room with Sita beside him, who guided him to the bench with a light hand on his shoulder and then stepped back to stand near the wall. Gabriel found the edge of the bench with his hand, sat down, and settled himself in the way Maria had watched him do dozens of times, back straight, feet finding the floor, hands resting on his thighs for a moment before moving to the keys. He played the first piece without stopping. It was a simple melody, gentle and unhurried, and the room was so quiet during it that Maria could hear the slight creak of someone shifting in their chair near the window. When it ended, there was a pause before the applause. The kind of pause that happens when people need a moment to come back to the room from wherever the music has taken them. The applause, when it came, was warm and genuine, and Gabriel turned his face toward it with an expression that was not quite a smile yet, but was moving in that direction. The second piece was longer and more demanding, and partway through it Gabriel made a small error in a transition he had struggled with during practice, recovering so smoothly that Maria suspected she was the only person in the room who noticed it because she knew exactly where it was supposed to be. She was standing near the doorway, having decided that her place was at the edge of the room rather than among the seated guests, and she watched his hands with the focused attention of someone who had guided those same hands across those same keys more times than she could count. The third piece was the one he had learned first, the simple 6-note melody that Maria had played for him on that very first afternoon when she sat beside him on the bench and placed his hand over hers. He had expanded it considerably since then with Sita's help, building it into something fuller and more complete, but the original sequence was still recognizable at the center of it, the bones of the thing still showing through the additions. Maria knew this, and she suspected Gabriel had chosen to end with it for that reason, though they had never discussed it directly. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment longer than after the first two pieces. Then Ernesto Reyes did something that no one in that room, including his sister who had known him for 50 years, had seen him do in a very long time. He crossed the room to the piano, put his hand on his son's shoulder, and stood there without speaking for several seconds. Gabriel reached up and placed his own hand briefly over his father's. The guests began to applaud, and someone near the window said something appreciative in a low voice. But Maria did not hear the words because she was watching the two of them at the piano and finding that her vision had gone slightly unclear in a way she was not going to apologize for. Afterward, when the guests had moved to the dining room where the housekeeper had arranged refreshments, Ernesto found Maria still in the music room, straightening the chairs back into their original positions out of habit. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching her work. Then he said her name, and when she turned he told her simply that he did not have the words for what she had given his son and his family, and that he hoped she understood that even if he could not fully express it. Maria told him that Gabriel had done the work himself, that she had only shown him where the keys were. Ernesto shook his head slightly and said that sometimes showing someone where the keys are is everything. She thought about that later, after the house had quieted and the guests had gone and Gabriel was in his room already half asleep, with a contentment that was visible even in the way he lay still. She thought about the afternoon 3 months ago when she had been humming while she cleaned, and a small boy had appeared in the doorway with his head tilted to one side, listening. She had not planned any of it. She had only responded to what was in front of her. A child reaching toward something, a room full of music waiting to be used, and a choice that in the moment had seemed very small but had turned out to be the kind of choice that changes the shape of things permanently, quietly, in ways that no one sees coming until they are already standing inside the result.